Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to speak in English, so those who need the headphones, they can put them on now, please. Big thanks on my part to the organizers for including us in the panel and in the research itself, because it's not the first time that we talk to each other with Massimo and with Gianluca and Gabriele about the project. We have
to restart, I think,
okay.
for the mic.
So, good afternoon to everybody, and thanks to the organizers for having us here, because it's not the first time actually that we've been invited to the workshops in frames of this project. I've participated to a meeting, to a workshop in Brussels, and we've been in exchange with Gianluca, with Massimo and Gabriele over emails. I'm very glad to be here because I think really that the topic of the panel and the project itself is very, very important. This is because of my work, of course. Maybe a couple of words about myself. I work as a researcher at the ETUI, and I'm a member of. I'm a member of a unit that is solely devoted to worker participation issues. We deal with various forms of representation. This is representation in European Works Councils, transnational representation of workers in SEs. It's okay. It's basically this. So it's the first slide. It's okay. I'll give you a sign. Yeah. So I'm part of this unit that deals also with European companies, SEs, and also with worker representation on board level. So there are different forms of that worker representation. There is another colleague also that works with us on information and consultation on national level. So we are basically trying to embrace the issue of worker representation from various angles, and in reference to various instruments that have been put by the European legislators at disposal of workers. And I think it's very, very important that we do it because it gives us the edge over employers, organizations, and over employers themselves in negotiations or even in terms of exerting pressure on the European Commission. The employers, as you probably know, do not have a specific research institute, do not have an institutionalized research behind their actions. The trade unions have here a great advantage in numerous forms, and MuMMIA is one of those, examples of that advantage, I think. Without further ado, I'd like to go on now to speaking about the database itself, the European Works Council's database. I will first start by saying a couple of words about where the database comes from. I'll then go on to presenting you the structure of the database on European Works Councils, and then a couple of figures that are based on research on worker representation in European companies. These are the two probably most important pillars of international worker representation in Europe nowadays. I will then conclude by showing you two websites that are publicly available and that can be used as a tool for worker representatives by EWC members in negotiations. So these are the three stages of my presentation. Just a brief word about where the database comes from and how it was started. The EWC database actually was started in 1995. At that time it was the beginning of the... can you still hear me? No? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. It was shortly after the introduction of the first EWC directive in 1994, when the trade unions started to collect information about European Works Councils. And it was continued over years. And funnily enough, Actually, Peter Kerkhoffs, who is at the Eurofund now, he used to work on the database himself for a long time. He actually brought me to the research on EWCs, so it's thanks to him that I'm sitting at the same table now a couple of years later. And I'm very grateful for that to him. Since 2006, the database is online. And since 2010, we have a couple of new substantial components of the database that I'll speak about later. The database, I mean, any collection of data on transnational forms of representation is really, really a tricky matter. And I think Peter and now Massimo, everyone who worked on that kind of data can confirm that it is not a simple thing. The directive basically speaks, the EWC directive, uses as a criterion for identifying companies that should have an EWC, very simple criteria. It should be a company that has in total at least 1,000 employees, and in 2 countries at least 150 employees. Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But in reality, the employee figures are by far the most difficult data to get hold of. There are some additional criteria about the company structure, but the gist of the requirements is actually the employee data, and this is the real pain in the neck. The database, in order to be able to embrace the complexity of the EWC of transnational worker representation, the database needs to be structured in a very clear manner, and therefore we actually have 3 components of the database. The first component is a sub-database of multinational companies that fall within the scope of the EWC directive. That means that fulfill the criteria that I've just mentioned. The second part of the database, the second component or a second sub-database, is actually a database collecting information about the European Works Councils themselves. And the third part of the database is a sub-database devoted to European companies. I'll come to speak to that a bit later. This is the very basic division, this is the very basic structure, but there are also other components, smaller components of the database that we try to collect data on, where we try to structure the information that we gather from trade unions, from EWCs themselves, so that we get the fullest possible picture of worker representation in Europe. But this is not the only division, this is not the only structure. That was more kind of a horizontal structure of the database. But in order to be able to grasp the complexity of the EWC sub-database itself, we needed to divide it into 3 levels. And I'm not going to speak too much about it, have no fear. I know it can be boring, but this is just to show how complex the data collection itself is. So in order to be able to say anything about EWCs, we need to, first of all, know in what companies those EWCs operate and what companies are covered. Second of all, we need to know in what companies which EWCs are established. And every EWC is based on at least one EWC agreement itself. But very rarely it's only one agreement. In numerous cases, these are multiple agreements you have an installation agreement that sets up an EWC, then you have revised versions of the agreement, you have amendments to the agreements. The colleagues who work on EWCs, who are members of EWCs, can tell you about many other documents and agreements that they sign throughout their career, throughout the life of EWC. You have what was referred to earlier on by Volker. You have transnational company agreements, which is yet another form of agreements signed by EWCs. So there is really a myriad of different texts, agreements, declarations that an EWC can sign throughout its lifetime. So I'll stop there, but I think it gives you an overview of really, if you want to do it in a structured way, what kind of requirements it brings with it. And Massimo and colleagues working on the MuMMIA project have already experienced that, I think, and that's when Massimo referred to difficulties in data collection. I believe that's what he wanted to say. If we go on now, one more, please. Yeah. The database then, at this stage, collects information about how many companies there are, how many EWCs there are, and how many agreements there are. But this is only a quantitative analysis, if you wish, which is complex enough already at this stage. But in order to be able to make the most of the analysis itself, we thought that it is necessary to go a bit further than that. It's not only to know that there is an agreement, it's not only to know that there is an EWC, but the purpose is also to know what is in the agreement itself. Who are the EWC members? Where do they come from? Which countries are represented? Which countries have a mandate but are not represented in an EWC? So all that kind of information was identified as crucial in order to be able to say something qualitative about the EWCs themselves. And since 2009, 2010, we have had a project of merging two databases that had existed in the past. There was a database by the Social Development Agency and the database by ETY. And basically, some of the data collection was doubled, but they were complementary in the fact that the ETY database was collecting information about the quantitative aspects of EWCs, and the SDA was doing research on the content of agreements. And we thought that by unifying those two databases, we will get an even bigger impact and we'll be able to say more about EWCs than by having them separately. And Marina Monaco, who is in the room here, started on the project with myself, where we went on to analyze the content of the agreements. And in the database, currently we have over 1,600 of agreements that were signed by various EWCs. This is by far not the entity of EWC agreements that were signed, but I think that we are close to, well, 85–90% of all agreements that have been signed by EWCs. It's an estimation. So we tried to look at what is in those agreements in order to be able to advise EWC members in negotiations on what can be negotiated, how far can you go, what are the good and bad examples in EWC agreements, what are the standards in other countries, because this was the feedback that we've been receiving by from many EWC members and from many sectoral federations. Yeah, that's the one. From many sectoral federations, that they would like to know what are the standards in other sectors. For instance, when industrial or the European Metalworkers Federation used to negotiate an agreement, they had those multisectoral companies that had activities in many sectors, and they wanted to know what are the standards in the financial sector, what are the standards in the tourism sector, because they had, for instance, a company that was active in 2, 3, or 4 sectors. So we were receiving these requests for data more and more often because the colleagues wanted to be able to negotiate more efficiently with the management. And therefore we developed in 2009, we developed a questionnaire or a analytic framework that was querying every EWC agreement by means of around 90 to 100 criteria. And we are trying to fill in that criteria by looking at the contents of the data, of the agreements themselves. And I will not go into the detail to tell you about every single question that we asked there, but we asked about, in general, constitutional issues. That means what is the law that applies to an EWC agreement, what are the parties to the agreement, whether this is a employee-only EWC or a joint EWC. We looked at the geographical scope and the distribution of seats. We looked at how the meetings are organized, the plenary meetings, the extraordinary meetings, who chairs the meetings, etc., etc. What is the procedure for calling extraordinary meetings in cases of restructuring? We looked at the definitions of information and consultation, but not only at the definitions, but a bit under the surface also. What are the competences? What is the scope of those definitions? What are the agenda items that are discussed by an EWC? We looked at something that was mentioned earlier on at the language facilities for EWC members, and a very important aspect of their activity, because we felt that it's necessary to be able to say whether the agreement guarantees for the members interpretation, for instance, interpretation in all languages or only in 2 or 3 selected languages, whether the EWC members have access to agreements that are sent to them beforehand, before the meeting, in their native language, or whether they need to resort to some kind of a privately organized translation at home, I don't know, using Google Translate, and struggling with the language already in advance of the meeting. We looked at how the select committee, the presiding committee is working. What is the composition? What are the competences? So a lot of questions, and we've only just finished the project. It took us 3 years to actually go through all the 1,600 plus agreements. We haven't started the analysis of the outcomes yet, but we have the empirical data for that. And I'm really very glad, and I must say also relieved, that it's done, because it was a mammoth task. But those results will be made available, I think, within a year or something like that. Already now we have identified a group of the so-called good practices and bad practices, so solutions, for instance, in the area of transnational competence of an EWC. What are the good provisions in the agreements that one could copy and use in negotiations? What are provisions on transnationality that limit this competence of an EWC in a way that obstructs an effective work of EWC? And those good and bad practices we have in, I think, around 70 to 90 different areas, and it's still being developed. So these are the tools that we are preparing for further negotiation, and I think it becomes very, very important nowadays with the recast directive in place, where we observe a new wave of negotiations. And now, after this lengthy explanation of how complex it is to work with the data, I would like to reward you a bit by showing a couple of results that you can achieve, that you can, how you can show all this laboriously collected data, and what one can do, what information does the database actually produce after all that hard work of putting in the data. We can see on this slide, by having all the data that I mentioned earlier on, we can produce a clear overview how the number of EWCs developed over years. We can say not only how many EWCs are there today, but by each year, actually, we can say how many new EWCs were created, how many EWCs were dissolved, how many EWCs were dissolved because of a merger, how many EWCs were dissolved because of a merger in Hungary, for instance. So you can go very, very deep in terms of finding the relevant information once you have it already in the database. And it really is an advantage over the employers, because trade unions, by means of the European Trade Union Institute, but this is a collective effort of the federations, of national trade unions, of individual EWC members who provide the data, allow us to discuss and show the Commission, the European Commission, listen, there are loopholes in this and that area, because the Commission does not have a separate database. It's really the trade unions who have this unique resource, and that gives us the position to say there is action needed, there are amendments to law needed in this particular area. Okay, a couple of more slides showing what are the reasons for establishment. So you can, you can break the data down by what is the reason for establishment of a particular EWC in a particular year. We have prevalent numbers of installations from scratch, but we also observe a number of EWCs that are developed as spin-offs from existing companies, that are created from mergers of two companies that, by means of a merger, fulfill the criteria of the EWC. I should maybe come back to the first slide, actually. I'm sorry to jump like that, because I think I've skipped that one. It's back. Still back. Yeah, that's it. Exactly. I'm sorry for that jump over. But currently, the most recent figures are, we estimate, or we know of, around 1,260 EWCs that have ever existed. That's the total number of EWCs that have ever been created that we know of. But I emphasize the fact that there are probably more EWCs, not many more, but some more, of which we haven't found out because they were not unionized, there weren't any trade union members on those EWCs. At the moment, as far as we know, there are 1,030 EWCs that are in operation, and there are 955 multinational companies in which an EWC is established. That means that in some multinational companies you have more than one EWC, and this is legally possible. You can have the so-called sectoral EWCs. So sometimes multinational companies active in more than one sector, they would have an EWC for the tourism sector, for the financial services sector, and for metal production, metal manufacturing sector. It gives them the flexibility of focusing on the sector itself and not discussing general issues on the general EWC, which can lead to a situation that the colleagues active working in the tourism sector of this particular company would need to hear and discuss things that are relevant only for the metal sector. So those sectoral EWCs allow to go more into detail, but this is not the only solution. There are around 60 EWCs in negotiation. Probably there are more, but there are around 60 that we know of. And in total, there have been less than 200 EWCs that were dissolved for some reason, either due to a merger or due to the company not fulfilling the criteria anymore. It is another estimation that I'm making here. There are probably more than 1,400 companies that still fulfill the criteria of the directive but do not have an EWC. And I'm very, very cautious about this figure. It's an estimation because of the earlier difficulties that I mentioned. It's extremely difficult to identify companies in Europe that fulfill those two simple criteria, 1,000 employees in total and 2 times 150 employees in Europe. It sounds so simple, but it's so bloody difficult. We have tried many ways. We have tried to collect the data ourselves, which turned out eventually not possible because it is a huge task. We tried to buy external commercially available databases which weren't performing either. So you have a company that has a couple of hundred of researchers that work only on finding out information about companies, and still they cannot deliver 100% guaranteed information about those multinational companies. And there is no legal obligation for companies to report about the employee figures and about their structures. And this is the biggest difficulty, actually, because if we would have this obligation imposed on all companies in Europe, I mean, the matter is clean and solved, and it saves us a lot of work and it gives us a lot of certainty. But of course, it's not possible due to the objections of the employers' organizations. In total, there are around, it's another estimation, but around 17-18 million of workers employed in companies that have an EWC. So we are talking here big numbers of people who actually at least theoretically, have access to information about transnational activities of a company. And in total, we estimate also that there are around 16 to 21,000 EWC members themselves. If we multiply the number of EWCs that we've ever had by an average number of 15 to 20 EWC members per EWC, these are the numbers we are talking about. These are very rough estimations, but it's just to give you an idea that we've already, throughout those 15 or more than 15 years of EWC legislation in Europe, we have an army of people who have heard about an EWC, who have been affected, or who have actually sat on the EWC. And I'll now go on to finish the presentation. I will not show you all the data, but we can clearly say how many EWCs have there been created in a specific country. And here, interestingly, Germany has the most number of EWCs, but it's also the United States, the US companies that are active in Europe that have a lot of EWCs, but they differ quite significantly, because usually the US companies, they want to just tick off the obligation of having an EWC, but in terms of quality, it's often below what the European-based companies provide in terms of information and consultation. We can skip the next one. This is, I've already shown that. We can also show the sectors. We can find out the sectors in which companies are EWCs are active. And here, by far, as was already mentioned earlier on during the day, the metal sector is by far the most numerous one, but also the chemicals have a large number of EWCs, and then you have building and woodwork as a big federation, and also the tourism, agriculture, that means effort, who host a big number of EWCs. I'm drawing to an end, really, just giving you a couple of indications about how the EWCs are also distributed. Not every company has the same chance of having an EWC, so to say, statistically. The bigger the company, the bigger the probability of an EWC. So it means that it's much easier to establish an EWC in very large companies, but surprisingly also in the smaller multinational companies that employ between 1,000 and 5,000 of employees. It is similarly more easy to establish an EWC in a company that is active in a big number of countries. Those multinational companies that have activities in more than 10 countries account for more than 50% of EWCs. So the bigger the company in terms of activity and the bigger the company in terms of employees, the easier it should be theoretically to establish an EWC. I will conclude now by pointing towards one other aspect of our activities at ETUI that we focus on. These are also SEs, the European companies, but as they are not the gist of the project themselves, I will not speak about them. You can find all the data concerning the SEs and EWCs on two websites. This is at the end. Exactly, there are two. Yeah, that's this address, ewcdb.eu, is the portal for the EWC database. This is where you can find all the information that I've spoken about and much more. You can find information about, for instance, court cases in which the EWCs were involved, what was the content of the court case, etc., etc. So there are also statistics. If you want to find some of the statistics that I've shown, you can find them on this website as well. And if you're looking for information about the SEs, but also on other forms of worker representation, this is the next website, worker participation. Gabriela, if you could, one more. The workerparticipation.eu is a broader website that gives information about the worker representation in SEs, in EWCs, in national works councils, on board level. As you know, we have legislation that allows employee representatives to sit on supervisory boards or administrative boards. And you can find on this website, you can also find information about industrial relations in individual countries. What is the trade union structure? You can make comparative tables when you go to an EWC meeting and you don't know anything about the structure of Italian trade unions. And you will have colleagues from France. You can simply choose those two countries and find information that you want to know about those countries. Trade unions, collective bargaining, information consultation legislation. So I hope I haven't bored you to death, but I think there is a lot of data available by trade unions and to trade unions already. And I think it is really a huge challenge to use it now and also to get the feedback from the users themselves, that is from trade unionists, on how we, the researchers, can improve it. Thank you for your attention.